Grace and peace. Welcome to Sabbath School Study Group. My name is Chris Bailey, and I'm glad that you're making us a part of your day, because in this 5-part series, we're going to look at the conversion of Peter. In reality, we're going to really kind of step back and look at Acts chapter 10 and 11 and 12 to better understand the events of the early church, the people of God who continued the work of Christ. When he ascended to glory, his spirit came upon people just like you and me. And one of those was a man named Peter, and that's what we're going to look at in this series. And so we start with a word of prayer, asking that, Lord, you would help us to know how you worked and operated in the past, to give us hope to know what you're going to do for us today, in Jesus' name. Amen. At Cornelius' house is the title of our focus right now. And the big 3 points that we want to get from this story, when we look at the exchange between Cornelius and Peter, it really plays this role of showing the exchange of the gospel from Jew to Gentile, where the entire world now is not just eligible, but we actually see them become active in the work of telling the story of Jesus. So our focus verse goes to Acts 10, verse 34 to 35, where Peter testifies, "Then Peter opened his mouth and said, 'Of a truth, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him.'" When we remember these words as they're testified in Peter's life, we see in the story of the Lord coming to Cornelius while he was in prayer. It shows us our very first point, in that we, you and I, the people that the Lord made and saved, are the house the Lord seeks to dwell in. Here's how we meet Cornelius. In Acts chapter 10, verses 1 through 3, there was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of the band called the Italian band, a devout man, and one that feared God with all his house, which gave much alms to the people, and prayed to God always. He saw in a vision, evidently about the 9th hour of the day, an angel of God coming in to him, and saying unto him, "Cornelius." He is met while he is coming to spend time alone with God and in meditation of the word. He is now met by an angel from the Lord. And he comes to tell him that, hey, I want to do something in you. And this is an echo of what we see in the Gospel of Ephesians, chapter 2, verse 18 to 20, when Paul is explaining the work of the Spirit in our lives. It says, "For through him we both have access by one Spirit unto the Father. Now therefore ye are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God, and are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone." Jesus Christ is the chief cornerstone, and it's the ministry of apostles and prophets that create the body of God. But his ultimate goal is that he would abide in us. That's why if you go forward and look at verse 21 of Ephesians 2, "In whom all the building fitly framed together groweth into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom ye also are builded together for a habitation of God through the Spirit." See, as long as Peter and others of his heritage and culture limited the scope of the gospel to being dependent on who you were and limited by who you were not, it would not fulfill this promise of the new covenant, this promise of what Jesus desired to have with all of us, not just to dwell with us, but now that we would be a habitation of God through his Spirit, that the Spirit of God would dwell in us. So to help us to see that this was his desire, he sends an angel now, not to Peter first, but to Cornelius. Not just a Gentile, but a Roman. And not just a Roman, a centurion in the Roman army. But the power of Jesus turned his life inside out, upside down, and made him available. And that's why he is a symbol of you and me, the Lord wanting to live in us. So when we see what happens here in the life of Cornelius, we also see that in the experience of both Cornelius and Peter, prayer opened them to receive. Prayer opened both Cornelius and Peter to receive. Acts 10:9 says, "On the morrow, as they went on their journey and drew nigh to the city, Peter went up upon the housetop to pray about the 6th hour, and he became very hungry and would have eaten. But while they made ready, he fell into a trance." So in other words, he goes into vision. Now see what happens up when Cornelius is praying in verse 2. A devout man and one that feared God with all his house, which gave much alms to the people and prayed to God always. He saw in a vision evidently about the 9th hour of the day an angel of God coming into him and saying unto him. Now watch this in verse 30, as Cornelius is telling his experience from the early part of the chapter to Peter. Cornelius said, 4 days ago I was fasting until this hour. And at the 9th hour I prayed in my house, and behold, a man stood before me in bright clothing, and said, Cornelius, thy prayer is heard, and thine alms are had in remembrance in the sight of God. This is incredible because one man is praying and fasting, and the other man is praying and hungry, and the Lord comes to both of them in prayer. This is showing us that the avenue of connectivity in the early church was that of prayer, not policy. It wasn't about who you knew to get ahead, but it was about knowing the Father through Jesus Christ and his Spirit. That allowed you now to have access with the King of Kings and Lord of Lords through one of his representatives. Cornelius called him a man who stood before him in bright clothing. Peter knows that he's going into vision, but God makes himself known to these men because they're in prayer. They're talking to him and they're waiting for him. And in waiting, he honored their faith. Finally, when we look at the story of Cornelius and Peter, we realize the ultimate glory is that God is no respecter of persons. In our first point, we realize that the Lord wants to live in us. And guess what? The Lord is willing to live in any of us if we're willing to abide in him. Acts chapter 10, verse 12. Here's what it says. Wherein were all manner of four-footed beasts. Now, this is in the vision that Peter is having before he goes to meet Cornelius, who's being told to be preparing for the arrival of Peter. In this vision were all manner of four-footed beasts of the earth, and wild beasts, and creeping things, and fowls of the air. And there came a voice to him, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, Not so, Lord, for I've never eaten anything that is common nor unclean. And the voice spake unto him again the second time, What God hath cleansed, that thou call not common. What God has made clean, don't call it common. And guess what? What he calls common, don't try to make it clean. So when Peter was thinking about Cornelius, it is custom to think of Cornelius as unclean. He was a Gentile, as uncircumcised. But here is the gospel. God is no respecter of persons because he wants to abide in all of his children. In fact, verse 34, Peter opens his mouth and he realizes, oh, the Lord is giving me a parable here. He's using this allegorically to teach me this principle. I perceive that God is no respecter of persons. The Lord was not telling him to get up and go eat barbecue. The Lord was not telling him to get up and go eat cockroaches. No, what he was trying to help him to see was that what I would call dirty or unfit or unclean, on the cross, Jesus saved. And now those individuals have equal access and just as much opportunity to know the Lord as I did when he walked here. Because when he is in the vision, he says, no, Lord. He doesn't speak to him as an angel, but he takes this as Jesus telling him what to do. And he responds to him in kind. And we would look at that and say, wow, Peter was so close. But guess what? That same Lord was working with a centurion named Cornelius. And that's why Peter had to then see, I realize now in verse 35, in every nation, he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him. Whoever loves Jesus back, they will become those who also have the presence of the Spirit in their lives. In fact, verse 42 says, he commanded us to preach unto the people and to testify that it is he which was ordained of God to be the judge of the quick and the dead, to give him all the prophets witness that through his name whosoever believeth in him shall receive remission of sins. Guess what? That includes you and me. The whosoever and the whomsoever and the wherever, that covers us. Right now, where you're listening, where you're watching, it covers you. That we now have access because he has given us remission. And to make sure that that remission is received through transmission, we have the testimony of Cornelius, that no one is outside of the bounds of grace. No one is unavailable salvation. The only thing that can keep us from the cross is our choice. But the beautiful gift now of Jesus and the life and the death and his resurrection is for all, because God is no respecter of persons. Acts 10, verse 34 to 35. This is what the Bible reminds us. Then Peter opened his mouth and said, "Of a truth, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him." If you were blessed by what you just saw and heard, praise Jesus. We're glad, in fact, so glad that we want to invite you to visit our website, CHANGEministry.org, where you will find this and so much more to encourage your walk with Christ. If you feel impressed, we'd also appreciate a donation that would support our ministry. We are trying to create a fund that would allow us to travel to any church, any school, anywhere, totally free of charge. And so we appreciate your support, not just of this ministry, but the work of change.